My name's Alex, and I'm here with Loren, and we're presenting our policy submission on domestic violence perpetrators, intervention and practice.
So the purpose of our policy submission is to inform you of issues arising from perpetrators of domestic violence and the ongoing behaviour towards offending, and also just the lack of support and strategy for changing this behaviour. And we want to obtain an indication from you which of the options that we'll list later, if any, you wish to proceed upon.
So just a brief background and case study on it all. On the 8th of September 2015, there was a pretty highly publicised incident where Tara Brown, a Gold Coast resident, was murdered by her partner. Her partner previously had many convictions, 3 of which were domestic violence orders. Each of these, were broken, and there wasn't really much interest towards or newsworthy information about the work that was done with him to prevent domestic violence, rather than punitive approaches. So exploring this really was informed by sort of what needs to change to address these behaviours.
And so looking further into that, we wanted to address the current budget that's just come out. And I'm just going to read a quote from that, which says, "This year's budget has no additional funding for domestic violence services. However, as part of the Women's Safety Package, last year's 17-18 budget included $3.4 million in funding over 2 years to expand the trial of domestic violence units in legal centres around Australia. The DVUs will provide legal and other assistance such as financial counselling, tenancy assistance, trauma counselling, emergency accommodation, family law services and employment services to women who are experiencing or at risk of domestic or family violence. The location of DVUs was announced in October 2017 in high-need areas of each state and the Northern Territory." So we're definitely aware of what's going on in terms of funding for women, which is absolutely great and should not be stopped. But we see that there's still a need for emphasis on perpetrator behaviour in the response to family and intimate violence. Myers' 2017 paper on perpetrator behaviour looked at the need for policy to address the responsibility of perpetrators in familial relationships and reducing exposure to violence, which is something Alex will address more later. There's an increasing number of studies into correlation between children's development in both immediate and long-term exposure to violence and then later violence. And also there's been discussion around the impact of motivation in behavioural change, and especially fatherhood in this, which is important when we're looking at family violence. There have been a few key notes that motivation can lead to or come from a sense of entitlement, but we still want to look at a long-term cultural shift for behavioural change, as this current stance links to a failed acknowledgement of one's behaviour playing a role in the victimisation of another person.
So to really explore the issue, we decided to conduct a literature review, which really sort of draws from a real vast number of sources. And we've really identified it as an issue as, as I said previously, it's widely publicised in this country, and especially Queensland. And we decided to explore it because, domestic and family violence isn't limited to any particular class or culture. And really sort of what we've found within the literature review is we wanted to really explore characteristics first, and there's a link between exposure to domestic violence and perpetrating in the future, which can also be stemmed from anxiety and depression, which is caused by onset trauma. And when we really sort of looked into what really barriers existed towards work with these perpetrators, it really came down to a number of things. And some of these approaches, while they are therapeutic in nature, they fail to take into account psychological instances, and thus are deemed ineffective. We've also explored the systemic influences which impact on the environments of domestic violence. So by taking into account notions around anxiety and behaviours, social perception, and oftentimes can be a hindrance in the reduction of recidivism. Domestic violence perpetrators, I guess, in the media are often seen as almost an undeserving client. And by that sense, news articles in that sense really focus on what occurred as opposed to why it occurred. And again, it was mentioned previously that while there is a focus on safety, and that is important, these behaviours will just continue as long as it's not being addressed at first hand to the perpetrators themselves.
In addition to the LIT review, we also had a look at some specific programs already in place across Australia and even the world just to do with perpetrators. This included cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, impulse control approaches, education, especially regarding gender inequities, and a specific model that I'll explore called the dualist model. So this model came out of a town of the same name back in the 80s. And it's an approach that focuses on accountability for actions and consequences of perpetrators' behaviour. It's an educational model, but it engages perpetrators in discussions, and they talk about control, dominance, experience of self and victims, and it works to challenge societal norms and beliefs about violence and other sorts of familial and intimate partner abuse. So by exploring definitions of danger and safety, they're able to understand better what actually is abuse and steer away from that. They also advocate for restorative processes for victims, so it's not just one-sided, and it can be used all across the judicial process. CBT also works by addressing learned behaviours and by altering them, which can include violent attitudes and behaviours and issues of dominance and superiority, which we addressed when we talk about motivation. In addition to this, the National Domestic and Family Violence Bench Book of 2017 recognise the limited research and trials currently occurring in Australian court systems and the offending that they address. These programs and their evaluations lend to the argument that's already at play that the priority for response and safety for restoration is restoration for victims, but doesn't really put resources towards perpetrators. Finally, on this point, the South Australian courts in Australia have already implemented an abuse prevention program that offers men behavioural change interventions regarding abuse towards partners and former partners of theirs. The intervention is a result of court referrals, which is something we are interested in, as it can be an intervention order, either as bail condition or an order in itself. They offer programs that are tailored to be sensitive to the needs of culture, especially metropolitan versus rural, and including Indigenous perpetrators. The results also suggest that reoffending rates do decrease for participants.
Cool. Yeah, so basically, exploring our options here. Option one would simply be things staying the same, which is continue to implement existing strategies with no introduction of further perpetrator-focused response. This option allows current initiatives to continue and requires no extra funding or resources. Option two is a real change which would occur sort of generationally, which is a change in the systemic influences towards domestic violence and a big focus on rehabilitation as well as safety for victims. Option three is a sort of in-between and revolves around providing early intervention as first response to domestic violence perpetrators and cater responses and programs towards perpetrators through multidisciplinary teams. And it's sort of delivered person-centered as well, so it sort of caters to that particular perpetrator.
And so just finally, the way that we'll implement and strategize this is working with police to ensure suitability of referral to programs, building rapport with perpetrators, beginning with individual work, though future practice could be determined and catered towards, a wider range of offenders, but you want to be focused on the individual and their specific circumstance. We want to build on empathetic tendencies. And we also do want to draw from existing programs across the world, such as the dualist model, looking at South Australia and any things that are already in place within Queensland, which we will continue to explore as we finalise this policy submission. Thank you very much for listening to us today.
Thank you.